Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're delighted to be joined by Illinois State Representative Jennifer Gong-Gershowitz. Jennifer is from Oak Park, Illinois. She went to Indiana University, went to law school at Loyola, actually got a master's degree in international law from Northwestern. Began her career at Winston & Strawn, an important firm in Chicago, and then has moved into some really interesting areas in human rights and immigration law, including the National Immigrant Justice Center and the Northern Suburban Legal Aid Clinic, where she built their immigration practice. She ran for the Illinois General Assembly, the 17th District in 2018, won, and has done some amazing work in Springfield. She chairs a new committee, relatively new committee called Immigration and Human Rights. We want to hear a lot about that. And Jennifer really won national attention this spring by helping push through the General Assembly the first law in the country that requires the teaching of Asian American history in public elementary and high schools in Illinois. So we want to get kind of the backstory on that new law, really important law, and just some of both the opportunities and challenges of implementation. And the representative is joining us from her home in Glenview, Illinois. So good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your background. You grew up in Oak Park, and I looked at your website, and you talk about, growing up, your dad was a veteran who was active in civil rights issues. Your mom was very active in the Equal Rights Amendment push. In fact, you have a wonderful photograph of your mom driving a bike in a parade, and you're kind of perched precariously on the front of it as you are going through the parade. So tell us about the early years growing up, the influence of your parents, schooling, and so forth.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Oak Park, which, is a reputation for being a progressive community, a diverse community. And my parents are both transplants from the West Coast. My mom grew up in California, and my father, the son of Chinese immigrants, grew up in Portland. And I think in many respects, meeting in California at UCLA in the 1960s, they were very much influenced by the time, as well as their family backgrounds. My mom, from a white working class family, the first in her family ever to go to college. My father, the son of Chinese immigrants, the youngest of 5 children, I think very much wanted to escape the constraints both of family and community that they found confining in many ways. Coming to Chicago and discovering the Midwest to be a little less open-minded than they had expected, I think. Having a hard time finding a place as a biracial couple, a mixed race couple, to live, and found themselves renting an apartment on the west side of Chicago in the Austin neighborhood, which is where I was born. And then ultimately buying a house in Oak Park. My dad was a community college teacher and art historian at Triton College. And I grew up in Oak Park and found oftentimes that what people say and what they do in practice to be very different. Growing up, I'm obviously a biracial, half Chinese, half white, and I really struggled, I think, with both, a sense of, internal and external identity. And I didn't know what to make of all of that until much later in my life. And I hope we have a chance to talk about sort of that journey to really discovering my own family's history, and connecting that experience to my own life experience growing up in Oak Park, where the Asian American experience was invisible. And of course, Asian Americans have a long history of invisibility and exclusion. But I don't recall any attempt whatsoever throughout my K through 12 education to talk about the Asian American experience, to give either Asians or non-Asian students any sense for the Asian American experience, which of course is part of American history. And so it was not until law school that I was studying the immigration laws, started to learn about the history of exclusion acts, which targeted Chinese Americans, that my own family's told history didn't add up to the realities of the timeline of immigration law and how that impacted Asian Americans in this country, which led me to ask a lot of questions and ultimately led me to journey to Portland, Oregon, to discover the truth about my own family's immigration experience. But growing up in Oak Park gave me, I think, at least a window into the complexities of race in America, and the work in progress that we are all experiencing, I think, and having important conversations now looking back over some of those experiences have been instructive in my work in the General Assembly.
Well, tell us a little bit about your Indiana University years, what you studied, and then from there transition to Loyola, which is, I think, where you really had this kind of academic encounter with, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act and how that connected to your own family. So if you could maybe start at Indiana and then go to your Loyola time.
Sure. So I was a journalism major at Indiana University. I have always enjoyed the spoken word and very much enjoyed, you know, learning about how to investigate, research, and convey information in the School of Journalism. But what really sparked my interest the most was my course on First Amendment law. So I still remember the classroom. I remember the professor. You know, it's funny when you have those aha moments in life. You know, something about your educational experience that changes what you're, you know, what you pursue later on in life. And for me, that was a First Amendment law course, and it was, of course, in the context of the School of Journalism, relevant to journalists working, you know, of course, you know, and needing to understand the laws around free speech. But what I was fascinated about was the impact of the rule of law in shaping policy, and the ability of lawyers to create change and make a difference, utilizing, you know, the tools that lawyers use to both advance public policy and to represent and advocate for their clients. And so it was really that course in First Amendment law in the journalism school that sparked my interest in going to law school. My parents were very generous in providing me with an undergraduate degree and paid for my studies at Indiana. But law school, you know, was going to be something that I was going to have to undertake on my own. So I spent a few years working and saving money, and I started at Loyola Law School, really, you know, wanting and enjoying every single course and the opportunity to put into context not only the Constitution and our founding values, but how those have evolved over practice and over time to reflect the way that the next generation interprets those principles, right? I absolutely loved my experience in law school and had the opportunity to compete nationally in moot court competitions. Competed in the Thomas Tang National Moot Court Competition, which was designed to give Asian American lawyers an opportunity to compete with other Asian American law students around the country, won nationals, and then went on to Winston and Strawn. But it was really at Loyola that I connected both my study of law, my knowledge of, and what I then discovered was my limited knowledge of US and Asian American history to my own family's experience. Because it was in an immigration law course that we studied the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And I learned for the first time that it was not until 1952 that Asians were able to naturalize as US citizens. And it wasn't until 1943 that the Chinese Exclusion Acts were ultimately repealed. I knew that my grandparents came to the United States in the 1920s. And I had been told the fairy tale version of the immigrant story. You know, grandparents came, started a business, raised 5 children, all went to college, became doctors, professors, musicians, artists, but it wasn't adding up. And when I started talking and asking questions, I learned that my family had been subject to deportation proceedings under the Chinese Exclusion Acts and had fought their deportation for over a decade with the help of a civil rights attorney named Irv Goodman, who was a celebrated civil rights lawyer in Portland. And I traveled to Portland and I did my own research, looking at the microfilm of the news coverage at the time, using some of that journalism background that I got in Indiana, sitting in the libraries and pulling news coverage of my family's immigration case to learn more. I then sought out the only living relative of the attorney who had represented my family. And I had this amazing moment where I got to meet her, and she gave me a traditional Chinese garment that my grandparents had given to her brother-in-law as a thank you for the years that he dedicated his life to championing the civil rights of my grandparents. I wore that, pieces of that garment, the day that the Teach Act was signed. But it was really that inspired not only my curiosity about my own family's experience, but then the ability of lawyers to make a difference, to use that training to pay it forward and do that for somebody else. And so when I graduated from Loyola, I went on to Winston and Strawn. And my practice was not an immigration practice at Winston. I was in the litigation department, doing predominantly securities and exchange litigation. And the firm at that time did not do any pro bono immigration work at all. So I asked whether or not I might foray the firm into doing some pro bono immigration work, and found somebody to support and sponsor my doing so. And I teamed up with the National Immigrant Justice Center and ended up taking on the first ever trafficking case in immigration court in Illinois. And back in the late 1990s, there was no precedent for trafficking as a grounds for asylum. It was not a recognized grounds for persecution. There was no TV for victims of trafficking. And I quickly realized that, through the lens of what I had learned from my mother, who raised me to challenge the gender-based norms that her generation had grown up with, and recognized immediately that the law reflected a lot of those same attitudes and notions about women, and more by omission. So the definition of persecution omitted the kinds of harms that happen to women in the world, forced marriage, and other harms that we now recognize in the human rights space as being a violation of a woman's fundamental rights were not recognized as grounds for asylum. And so I set out to change that, taking on gender-based persecution cases, and along the way, finding both legal and procedural hurdles. For example, in the case involving the child who had been trafficked, there was no mechanism for me to be appointed as her attorney, and the traffickers had already hired a lawyer to get her out of custody. And so I searched through the federal rules of procedure at the time and created a motion to appoint a guardian ad litem, which became then a model for how we would handle cases involving unaccompanied immigrant children, to appoint a guardian ad litem, a pro bono social worker, not to act as the attorney for the child, but to act in the child's best interests. So that if you had a situation where the legal decisions might be at odds with what somebody standing in the role of a parent might think was the child's best interest, you had somebody advancing that aspect of that need to protect the child. And it was really that case that took tremendous resources, the resources of a large law firm like Winston and Strawn, and a lawyer who didn't know the word no, to carve out and win the first trafficking case in Illinois in immigration court. And then I went on from there to take on other cases of first impression, gender-based persecution cases, again, focused on this issue that our immigration law and human rights law in general, both here in the US and internationally, did not recognize the kinds of harm that happened to women. I focused on gender-based persecution, and then I got curious about how US civil rights law applied in the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course evolved in the aftermath of the Second World War, recognizing for the first time in human history, a universal set of human rights norms. And I wanted to study more about that. And so I went on to Northwestern, becoming the first American to graduate with a degree in international human rights law from Northwestern Law School, published on gendered war crimes, and really, learn the power of my own voice, the power of one, I say, the power of one person to change the trajectory on an issue. And so after, I had been at Northwestern and had the opportunity to broaden my understanding of US immigration and human rights law in the context of the larger debate and discussion on international human rights that had been codified in an international human rights framework in the aftermath of the Second World War, went on to build the immigration practice at the North Suburban Legal Aid Clinic. And it's interesting because as I look back on my career, I think there are many instances throughout my life where the best metaphor for what I've been doing is sort of building the plane while I fly. The North Suburban Legal Aid Clinic at the time had a shoestring budget, too small to obtain any state or federal funding for the kind of work we were doing. And then in the midst of my building that practice, Donald Trump was elected to be the president of the United States on an anti-immigrant platform that was anathema to everything that I believe this nation ought to stand for. And so in 2018, when my dear friend Laura Fine was stepping out of her seat to run for the Illinois State Senate, I threw my hat in the ring to run for a seat in the Illinois House, becoming only the second Asian American to ever be elected to the Illinois General Assembly. And I think this last year shows how much representation matters. That it took, finally having Asian Americans in the General Assembly to focus on what has been long overdue and missing in our classrooms. Really exciting to have been a part of a coalition. And this really was a coalition effort involving grassroots organizations from Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, my colleague in the Senate, my colleagues in the House. It was a heavy lift, and one that when we set out to do it seemed like a long shot, frankly. But I, as a student of immigration law, I have long, noticed the parallel between immigration law and policy, and the social status of Asian Americans in this country, which has always been perilous. And you don't need any more than the last year and a half to know that the model minority myth can flip back to those stereotypes of the dangerous minority and the scapegoat on a dime. And so education, in my view, is the best weapon against ignorance. And that has led to what I hope will be change for the next generation.
Well, I want to dive into that in just a second, but let's maybe get some of your overall impressions of how Springfield works. And I've talked to some legislators, in fact, Teresa Ma, just within the last year or so, who was saying that in Springfield, there is the big kind of epic battles on budget and taxes, but below that kind of top tier issues, there's a lot more cooperation and collegiality on other issues. Is that your experience?
Absolutely, 100%. I think people are always surprised to find that inside the bubble, we all know each other rather well. We spend a lot of time together, a lot of hours in Springfield, both on the floor and off the floor, and you get to know your colleagues as human beings. Which, I think is a key, to asking the right questions, developing relationships. That was certainly the case with the Teach Act. There were certainly, some detractors, but not hateful. And the bill passed with broad bipartisan majority support. And I think, when I talk to legislators around the country, that comes as a surprise to people. But I think the first step in creating change is always being willing to ask the hard questions, being willing to talk to people who might come from a different life experience. Every one of us, whether we come from a progressive town like Oak Park or a small town in Illinois, we come at the world with biases from our own life's experience. And I think in some ways, the most dangerous thing is to think that you are not, that you don't come at a problem, with your own point of view, your own life experiences. But what I've found incredibly gratifying is the willingness of my colleagues from all different walks of life, from vastly different backgrounds, to ask the hard questions. And if you can change hearts and minds in the General Assembly, maybe we got a shot at doing it right out there in the world. And I'm incredibly proud of what we've accomplished here in Illinois. I think a lot of people expect those kinds of things to come from the coasts. Given the size of the Asian American population in California, I frankly didn't realize that they hadn't passed a bill like this. It wasn't until we started working on the bill and I thought, there's no model for this anywhere. And it took Illinois to get across the finish line on Asian American history first, and hopefully we'll see it in other states. But yes, my experience in the General Assembly is very collegial. I think there are, relatively few issues where we are just, diametrically opposed and where you're just not going to find middle ground. And I'm a realist, we certainly have some of those, but the vast majority of issues and certainly policy is always better when you have the opportunity to hear other perspectives and to have people from a different life experience weigh in on, arriving at the best solution.
Well, let's talk about the genesis of the TEACH Act. And as I understand, through reading is that, there's early 2020, of course, with COVID exploding, one of the really awful aspects was an upsurge in anti-Asian American threats, et cetera. And I know there was a coalition that built in Illinois. I think there was a group in Chicago, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, that has worked closely with you. So tell us a little bit about the kind of the formation of this coalition and what you're trying to accomplish as you began work.
Yeah, so the idea for a bill on Asian American history was one that came to my attention from Andy Kang at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. And I'm not sure exactly, if the genesis of it, came from some of the work that had been done on the PBS documentary, Asian Americans. But the timing and the focus, of the Asian American community on trying to end the invisibility and exclusion of Asian Americans in curriculum, in media. My cousin, Stephen Gong, actually works for the Center for Asian American Media out in San Francisco and has been working for decades on, efforts to make Asian Americans more visible and more and less caricatured, frankly, in media. And so that work has been ongoing. Sadly, I think it took the scapegoating, once again, of Asian Americans, in this case for the pandemic, and the rise in anti-Asian hate and violence culminating in what we saw in Atlanta in a mass shooting, to really develop the momentum and the political will to really, really do something big. Curriculum mandates are very difficult. They're tough to pass even in a very blue state like Illinois. This was not, I did not take for granted that colleagues of mine on the Democratic side of the aisle would necessarily support a curriculum mandate in Asian American history. But I think in the wake of the obvious xenophobia and rise in hate, the call to do something about it became too large to ignore. And, despite having no Republican support for the bill in committee, by the time that bill got to the House floor, we had had the opportunity to really have some in-depth conversations about the necessity for filling that gap in our curriculum with knowledge and information that, frankly, has been long overdue and missing in our classrooms.
And it seems that the thrust of the educational experience that you want is both to tell Americans about some of the really horrible things and prejudices that have existed, but also to highlight the achievements of this community, which is a part that maybe is oftentimes neglected. Talk about both aspects of that.
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of people are surprised to learn, that Asian Americans were considered, undesirable, irrevocably foreign, and were not allowed to achieve citizenship through naturalization until 1952. But setting aside, the trajectory of immigration law that can really be seen in two parts. So pre-1965 and post-1965. So before 1965, I call that the exclusion era. A series of laws from 1790 through the Exclusion Acts and beyond created a category for Asian Americans that left Asian Americans as excludable aliens, which is a concept that is still foundational in our immigration law today. But before the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, the kinds of stereotypes that drove the Asian American experience were negative ones. Asian Americans were bad, foreign, the yellow invasion, and our immigration laws absolutely reflected a desire to exclude and to prevent Asian Americans from achieving citizenship, from becoming Americans. And yet we were here. Asian Americans have been here since the 1500s. The first Asian Americans arrived prior to English colonization. Filipino Americans built a community in what is now Louisiana in the early 1500s. And many Asian American families can trace their roots here in the United States back 6 generations. So far from this idea of Asian Americans as the new foreigner, Asian Americans have been part of American history for hundreds of years. It was actually in a case 70 years before Brown versus Board of Education, in the case of Tate versus Hurley, where an Asian American family sued to desegregate California schools successfully. It was a case brought by a Chinese American that established the principle of birthright citizenship, that is now, of course, embodied in the 14th Amendment. The first female gunnery sergeant in the U.S. Navy is a Korean American named Susan Ann Cuddy. The Asian Americans have played critical roles in the fight for civil rights. Larry Itliong, is one example. His work with Cesar Chavez, organizing Filipino farm workers. Asian Americans have been part of the fabric of American history. When you look at textbooks, you might see a reference to Japanese internment, which is, of course, a devastating example of, the power of law to segregate and racialize. But there are plenty of examples of Asian Americans as change agents, and yet that story isn't told either. And so what's critically important to this coalition, and no bill gets passed by one person, it is a coalition effort that involves many people and organizations, is that moving forward, we tell the story of Asian Americans not just from a perspective of exclusion and invisibility, but also in terms of our own agency around change. And the critical role that Asian Americans have played in the fight for civil rights, and in the fabric of American history. And it's interesting, it's as I see how fragile Asian American stereotypes often are. You can, like I said, really trace the shift in attitudes towards Asian Americans to the utility of the of those stereotypes based on the time. So before 1965, the laws very much tracked Asian Americans as an undesirable, as a excludable race of people. And then post 1965, and with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, our focus in the US on immigration shifted to one family reunification, and also a large percentage of visas set aside for skilled workers. Interestingly, the proponents of family reunification back in 1965 assumed that would ensure the predominance of European immigration, because at the time, 85% of the United States was white. But they, the impact of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act was that 20% of visas that were set aside for skilled workers. So subsequent to 1965, the vast majority of Asian immigrants come in, through that skilled, category, often already wealthy, already educated, and that has fed a model minority myth, which of course, the model minority myth, which, describes Asians as, overachieving, good at math, is driven as a foregone conclusion by our immigration policies. The 1990 Immigration Act, which established the H-1B visa, which brought in more workers, often Asians, to work in the computer industry, science, technology, again, reinforcing this model minority myth, this idea of Asian Americans as good at math, good at science, very studious. And of course, that serves a certain purpose as well. That model minority myth is used to success shame other racial minorities. And it's used to validate, American meritocracy, but it's policy and it's immigration policy that has driven and reinforced the model minority myth, with the vast majority of Asian Americans immigrating through those preference-based categories for skilled workers. It's always been interesting to me as a student of immigration law to see the parallels between the biases that lawmakers hold, that drive policy, that then have a profound impact on the social status of certain racial minority groups. And Asian Americans' social status in this country has been precarious at best. And, this last year, I think, has proven that. I mean, the stereotype of the model minority flipped on a dime once it was politically advantageous to scapegoat Asian Americans as the foreigner, as the cause for the pandemic, and of course violence and xenophobia ensued. And I think the Teach Act is one tool that we have in the toolbox to fill those gaps in knowledge with information, and to see our history comprehensively in a way that I think benefits us all. I've often said, you can't possibly hope to understand the present without understanding your past. And how can you ever hope to do better for the future unless you take very seriously the duty and obligation to look at our policies and ensure that, we do all that we can to undo the harm that has ensued from either overt or implicit racial bias in our policies, laws, and systems. I mean, I feel very much duty bound as a legislator to do exactly that.
Well, let's talk about implementing the law, because I think you and others have said that will be a challenge. School districts are allowed the leeway to implement it as they will, and stipulating the goodwill of everyone. Let's do that. It's going to be a challenge for some school districts. And I know the law refers to this PBS series, which was I've seen just parts of it. It's amazing. There's a whole instructional component, I think a 30 lesson plan that follows from that. So, I mean, what are the mechanics of how this is implemented in a way that, schools that want to do right and want to teach this important part of our history have the tools to do so?
Yeah, well, when we signed the bill, Carbondale, the superintendent of schools in Illinois, talked a little bit about the implementation. And so what was encouraging is to see her commitment to implementing the bill, at the very highest levels. And I know that the State Board of Education is working on putting together guidelines, both at the elementary level and at the high school level. So that, and what I think they're taking a smart approach. They put together working groups that include educators from the Asian American community. And they're working on putting together guidelines and resources that will be available to schools through the State Board of Education and available, on the website. And then it's really going to be up to grassroots organizations to reach out to school boards across the state and to provide resources. One of the things we've talked about in the Asian American Caucus is putting together a toolkit, taking what the State Board of Education, once the guidelines are released, and doing some outreach, really being proactive, reaching out to school boards with tools and information, readily digestible and easily downloaded from teachers across the state to make this easier. It's one thing to require something, it's another thing to provide the necessary resources to make it possible. And of course, one of the challenges, and I think, one of our strengths in the Asian American community is that we are not a monolith. Asian Americans now represent over 40 nationalities. And so the challenge is ensuring that Asian American curriculum represents the diversity of the Asian American experience. And that is going to look different too in communities throughout our state. I know one of my colleagues reached out to me. I think this was before the bill passed, and she said, I'm getting questions from community leaders in my community. She has a large Lao community in her district, and she said, will there be an opportunity for the refugee experience of certain communities here in Illinois to be told? And I said, absolutely. But that's going to take advocacy on the part of organizations in our communities to reach out to the school board and say, okay, so the State Board of Education has provided these broad curricular guidelines and resources. And in addition to that, we want to make sure that the story of our community is taught in our schools. Because, at the end of the day, the TEACH Act is about building empathy. And in order to do that, you need to ensure that people are seen.
Well, you've talked about the diversity of the Asian American community. And I guess as I was preparing for this, I was just astonished by reading some reports about even the size. It's 23 million now. The community will grow to, I guess, 46 million in 2060, 7% of both kind of the national population and an Illinois population. You've touched on it a little bit, but what about this community should people appreciate, apart from the fact that it's not monolithic? What are the kind of things that are most striking and maybe would be surprising for people to see and understand?
Wow. I think, what I would say is, we're a diverse community with, diverse needs and diverse experiences. I think, when I was preparing for this and thinking through, what kinds of resources might I recommend to people to get a sense of the breadth of the Asian American experience. And, you can't point to any one thing. You could watch a movie like Minari and get a sense for a Korean family, first generation, but that doesn't tell the whole story of the Asian American experience. Like I said, many Asian American families can trace their roots back 6 generations. Have been here in the United States, contributing in all the ways that each one of us as Americans, has experienced the country in very unique ways, from generation to generation. And then, of course, you have, the more, the subsequent to the Vietnam War, more recent immigrants from Southeast Asia, the Hmong community, the refugee experience, when you disaggregate the data, people are surprised how quickly that model minority myth falls apart. I think there is a stereotype of Asian Americans as, like I said, overachievers, really interested in the math and sciences, very good at math. And then, you have, when you disaggregate the data, you immediately learn that many of the refugee communities have come from Southeast Asia, in part because of foreign policies that the United States advanced, have really struggled, to integrate socioeconomically, and have, faced real challenges. That model minority myth falls apart rather quickly. And so, I think, when I think about the Asian American community, I don't think of any one thing. I can certainly speak from my own experience. I think one of the things that's probably universal, and I would guess, I obviously, I don't want to make too many assumptions, but what I would assume is similar in a lot of immigrant families, is there's this tension between the first generation, especially when you have immigrants that don't come from a Western culture, and the next generation born here. I saw it in my own family. I felt in many respects that my parents came from 2 different worlds. When my grandma Gong was a lion, a giant in my family and in my life. She was the boss of the family, born well before her time, born before Chinese women had any choices about their lives whatsoever. But she was powerful and a powerful figure in my life, but spoke very little English. I grew up understanding the tones and sounds of Cantonese, which was my family language, the Gong family language. And, you walked into my grandmother's home, and the smells and the sounds were my Chinese heritage. And then my mother's side of the family, white working class. No one had ever gone to college until my mother, and held a lot of prejudices about people who were different, and a lot of prejudices about my own, Chinese side of the family. And there is that ingrained tension between the immigrant experience and a culture that is very different from the one that the next generation is experiencing. And I think that is something that a lot of first generation, second generation Americans can identify with. And I always consider the first generation to be the ones who come because they're Americans, they're immigrants, but first generation Americans. And despite that being denied to my grandparents, until ironically they were allowed to immigrate as Mexican nationals. I find that ironic considering the politics of immigration today, that my Chinese grandparents could not immigrate or become naturalized US citizens as Chinese people because we were excludable aliens, not entitled to naturalize as citizens until 1952. But because they had come across the border from Mexico, rather than fight or try to defend the Chinese Exclusion Acts, under the, the 14th Amendment, the government said, well, wait a second, aren't you really Mexican? And allowed my Chinese grandparents a pathway to citizenship as Mexican nationals. And to my knowledge, we have no Mexican heritage. But I thought, how ironic, given the politics of immigration today, that's part of my family's story. And I think, in talking to my friends and others in the Asian American community, we all have these funny idiosyncrasies about our own family's experiences here in the United States. And I would hesitate to draw, any kind of broad brush conclusions, because I think all very unique.
Right. Jennifer, we have some questions from people, and we have three I'd like to read. The first comes from James from Wilmette, and he said, what are the big issues facing your constituents, and how are you helping address them? Which might be a good context for you to tell us a little bit about the 17th district. I was going to ask that earlier, but tell us a little bit about your constituents.
So I represent all or parts of Skokie, Wilmette, Evanston, Glenview, Northbrook, all of Gulf, and a little bit of Morton Grove. And I have an incredibly diverse district. I think based on the last population numbers that I saw, I think the third largest Asian American population in the state, of any House district, certainly. And so, when I'm out in the community, I said, in many respects, I think my district reflects the diversity of Illinois as a state. And the needs, again, vary. So we have a lot of small business owners in my district. And one of the things that I've focused on a lot is how to push out information during the pandemic to small businesses about the types of grants and programs there are to help get our small business community through a lot of the restrictions that hit small businesses really hard in my district. And then, of course, focusing on COVID recovery and relief. This last year, I learned more about every state agency in the state of Illinois than I think a lot of state reps learn in years, right? So working on helping constituents navigate unemployment issues through IDES occupied a tremendous amount of our bandwidth in the first 6 months of the pandemic, and is still ongoing. So there's a lot of COVID recovery and relief happening in the district that has really put state services front and center, helping families obtain relief with housing and utilities. And then, the broader issues of, ensuring that we fund public education. A lot of people say that they move into the 17th district because of the quality of our public schools. But we rely heavily in Illinois on property taxes to fund public education, which is fundamentally regressive. So I've been working really hard in the General Assembly since I've been there over the last 3 years to continue to push for fully funding the evidence-based model, which is our best hope for equalizing and increasing state funding for public education to reduce the reliance on property taxes over time.
We have a question from Jan from Philadelphia, and this we probably could spend another hour on this, but he and it's actually, maybe I preface it by saying I believe you're one of the few, maybe the only immigration lawyers in the General Assembly. But Jan asks, is there any practical way to handle the sheer number of undocumented people living in this country? How do we address the DACA people without raising the question of fairness by the general public? A lot to deal with there. So however you might want to slice and dice that question.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot to unpack there, right? And sometimes I think, you have to almost challenge the assumptions, right? In questions. And, the number of undocumented immigrants is largely driven by our own policies, where, we have a need for both skilled and seasonal labor. that drives immigration and migration. The same factors that have driven migration throughout the world, throughout history, apply equally to today. And so those same forces, if they're not matched with policies that are designed to, meet the needs of both our economic need for immigrants, with the types of jobs and opportunities for people to do so, through the visa process, you have a mismatch. And we have a mismatch in terms of our economic need and policy. And that, in my view, is the largest driver of, what the viewer describes as undocumented immigrants. And then, of course, in the case of, Chinese immigrants, when my grandparents came, you were by definition undocumented, purposefully so. And in fact, the United States government very much wanted Chinese labor to build the railroads, but for very overtly racist reasons, didn't want to give them a pathway to citizenship. So they were undocumented by design. So there are a lot of things that drive immigration. Most of those economic forces are what drive migration throughout the world and always have, throughout human history. But the legal status, undocumented is simply, it's a civil legal status, is driven by policy.
Nancy from Chicago congratulates you for your hard work on the TEACH Act and asks, can you share with the viewers several of the most critical events in Asian American history that you think should be included in the curriculum?
Wow. So, I think there were a few things that we initially included in the bill that we ultimately removed in the Senate because we wanted to be very careful not to be perceived as giving a list that we thought would be exhaustive. It is shocking to me that anybody could graduate from a K through 12 public school in Illinois and not know about the Korematsu case and the legalized internment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s, or have some knowledge of the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the impacts that has had on the social status of Asian Americans throughout history. But, I think it's equally important, as we talked about earlier, to point out the change agents in Asian American history, to talk about, the case of Tate versus Hurley and, the fight to desegregate California schools, really led by a Chinese American family. The case of Bhagat Singh, who worked, bringing case to the U.S. Supreme Court, challenging these racial classifications that have driven U.S. immigration law. I think that it's going to be fun for me as I have predominantly learned about Asian American history through my study of immigration law, to have this new opportunity to learn more about the history of Asian Americans from a different perspective. I mean, I have books on a list that others have given me that I'm anxious to read because I never had the opportunity to learn it when I was growing up. So I'm going to defer to the educators on, what should be the ultimate must knows in our curriculum on Asian American history, because there's just so much there. But I'm excited to learn more as we go through this process myself.
Well, kind of related, I think if you were on a train down to Springfield and talking to someone who's legitimately interested and said, I'd like to know more about the Asian American community. Where do I start? How do I begin? I know the PBS special is just astonishing. It's a 5-hour series. Are there a handful of other things you might point to as just a way to start beginning to understand the complexity and richness of this community?
Yeah, well, there are actually, I think 3 books that are sort of considered the treatises, if you will. If you wanted to take a deeper dive and get a real sense of Asian American history, Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki is considered to be, sort of the the starter treatise, right? And then really anything by Su-Cheng Chan, but she has a book, Asian Americans and Interpretive History, and you know, she's a scholar. So, you know, you can look up Su-Cheng Chan and pick what you're interested in. And then Erica Lee wrote a book, The Making of Asian America, more recently, which I think is a good, offers a good contemporary update to Takaki's book, which, you know, takes a look a little bit at more, you know, it tracks the, you know, the entirety of Asian American history, beginning with the 1500s, but also contains some contemporary themes, issues, and waves of immigration. And then, of course, I always recommend fiction too. You know, I was struck by The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston, which I think is an amazing lyrical novel that tells in an Asian American perspective in a different way. And then, of course, The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, which was turned into a movie. I don't think I've ever seen the movie. I read the book. But that speaks to that tension between generations and the Asian American experience. But I usually cringe, honestly, at the way that Asian Americans are portrayed in media. So you have to really dig to find a good example. I think Minari is one of the most recent best ones, you know, but of course told by a filmmaker who is himself Asian American. So not surprising, it was done in a way that I think honors the Asian American experience. But yeah, I think, you know, for people who don't know anything about Asian American history at all, which is most people, I think, the PBS documentary is available free. You can stream it on the PBS website. I think it's available on demand for free. And it is just excellent. You know, so that's a good, easy place to start. And then there's lots of places to go for a deeper dive.
Well, let me ask you more generally. We have a lot of students watching, and I like to ask our guests the question, and it's a hugely broad question, but you know, as people are thinking about launching professional careers, you've had this wonderfully successful career, which is blossoming, of course, but what have you learned? What would you, I know you have some college-age children, you know, when they say, what have you learned about launching a career, making an impact, strategizing about how to spend your time and energy? What do you suggest?
You know, it's funny. I think it's tempting to see a career in a straight line. And I think, like many of us, my career has been a winding road. And so I always encourage, you know, young people, and in particular my own children, to be open to new experiences, because it's amazing what happens when you know, you keep your options and your mind open to trying something that you didn't necessarily see yourself doing. I never thought I would run for public office. That was not an end goal. I didn't grow up imagining that I would be in politics. But when that door opened, it's about being ready to walk through it. And to be brave, and then also to be kind to yourself. I think we're often our own worst critics. And so I always tell my children, you know, mistakes are a part of life. You are going to make them, embrace them, learn from them. Don't be afraid to fall flat on your face and go for it. Because it's oftentimes, you know, when you get up with a few bumps and bruises that you learn your lesson the most. And that's just the universe trying to tell you something. So be kind to yourself and don't be afraid to fall flat on your face.
Well, let me ask you finally, I mean, you have this obviously active, busy life. How do you like to relax? How do you unwind when you have some free time?
Well, so that relaxing is not a strength of mine. I am, you know, I am self-described workaholic. And so, you know, for me to really relax and unwind, you know, it almost has to be, you know, scheduled in. And I like to exercise. So I set aside time to walk, run, you know, get in a workout. And then I love spending time with my children. They're really cool, interesting people. So I usually will just kind of, you know, insert myself into whatever it is that they're doing, and try to tag along. My youngest one likes to disc golf, and I'm terrible at it, but I'll go just to spend time with him. So I think, like a lot of moms, I find myself doing whatever it is that interests my children so I can spend more time with them.
Great. Well, Jennifer, thank you for just a really wonderful conversation. It's been great to hear your perspectives and to understand more about this really historic law that you helped push through the General Assembly. And I would urge everyone to read up on it, because it's an important initiative that's got national attention and is going to be an important part of our history going forward. So, and also when travel allows, we'd love to coax you down to Southern Illinois and visit us in person and talk to students and classes and see our community.
I'd love to, anytime. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series. And we will have a video of this on our website tomorrow. Please look at it, show it to family and friends. And thank you for continuing to support the Institute, keeping the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks.